All right, welcome to this explainer. Today we are diving into a really fascinating philosophical postmortem on Friedrich Nietzsche, looking specifically at the massive impact his ideas have had on modern secularism. The source material we're unpacking today lays out a pretty striking argument. Abandoning absolute truth doesn't just change the way we think, it actually fundamentally alters the value of human life itself. Let's get right into it.
God is dead, and we have killed him. You've probably heard this before, right? It's easily one of the most infamous statements in modern philosophy. Our source uses this to really establish the existential weight of a society that has unmoored itself from its religious anchor. Now, Nietzsche wasn't saying that a literal being died in the sky. He was observing this massive cultural decline of traditional belief in the West. He was basically pointing out that society had metaphorically murdered its ultimate source of moral absolutes. And as the source notes, grappling with the sheer terror of that realization may have actually been the very thing that eventually unraveled his mind.
Okay, let's start with part 1, the drift. Losing the anchor of absolute truth.
Now you might be wondering, where did this guy come from? Ironically, the man who pronounced God dead didn't exactly start out in a secular vacuum. Born in 1844, he was actually named after the King of Prussia and raised in this deeply devout Lutheran family. His dad was even a pastor. But as a young man, his intellectual drift really started kicking in. He was heavily influenced by the romantic literature of Friedrich Holderlin and those dramatic, myth-driven operas of Richard Wagner. And those influences essentially planted the seeds for these radical cultural critiques that would eventually totally consume him, right up until his severe mental breakdown in 1889.
This brings us to part 2, the genealogy, tracing the currents of radical thought.
It's pretty wild to look at the timeline here. Over a span of just 16 years, Nietzsche's core texts evolved incredibly fast. He went from exploring the chaos of Greek tragedy back in 1872 all the way to his fierce, culminating critique of religion in 1888's The Antichrist. Across all these works, the analysis identifies this consistent, escalating dismantling of traditional morality. It's like watching a storm gather strength.
So, if you remove God, what exactly takes his place? Well, Nietzsche's answer was the Übermensch, or the overman. Think of this as an idealized human being who totally transcends old, outdated moralities to create entirely new values, completely based on personal strength. In this philosophy, mankind steps beyond religion into this new state, where a person essentially becomes their own god, answering to absolutely nothing but their own power and self-mastery.
And listen to this quote. Man is a rope tied between beast and Übermensch, a rope over an abyss. It's really interesting how much this echoes Darwinism, isn't it? By calling man a rope, Nietzsche is heavily implying that our current version of humanity is just a stepping stone. According to the text, in this framework, only the absolute fittest are meant to cross that rope. And the rest of humanity? Well, they're merely something to be overcome, or just discard it entirely.
Which brings us to the absolute engine of his entire philosophy, the will to power. He believed this was the fundamental built-in drive in literally all living things, to assert control, to grow, and to expand your influence. Because of this idea, Nietzsche completely redefined the concept of good. Good was no longer about kindness or piety or anything like that. Good was simply anything that augmented your personal power. He fundamentally viewed life as this inherent, totally unapologetic struggle for domination.
So, what does this all mean for ethics? Well, it leads to this complete inversion of traditional values. Basically, Nietzsche split the world into two ethical camps. On one hand, you've got master morality, which praises the powerful, the noble, and the strong. And on the other hand, you have slave morality, which values things like compassion, humility, and altruism. He firmly believed the powerful should naturally rule the world, and that any system designed to protect the weak was fundamentally unnatural. Now, you're probably asking, if master morality is so natural, how did slave morality ever gain a foothold in society? Nietzsche chalked this up to something he called ressentiment. He actually believed traditional morality was born purely out of psychological frustration. The weak, since they were unable to physically defeat the strong, essentially engaged in this slave revolt of values. They made up a moral system that demonized the very strength they couldn't possess and magically elevated their own weakness as a virtue.
And this right here is exactly why he aimed so fiercely at Christianity. According to the source material, he viewed Christian ethics, which explicitly protect the oppressed and the vulnerable, as this totally unnatural hindrance to human evolution. He flat out called it a counter-movement against privilege and breeding. To him, it was a roadblock preventing the absolute strongest humans from achieving their maximum dominant potential.
The source points out a really stark warning from Nietzsche here. If we don't actively strive for the Übermensch, we end up devolving into what he called the last man. And the last man is basically just complacent. They only seek safety, comfort, and mediocrity. In his eyes, a society focused on equality was just a breeding ground for these uninspired last men.
Which leads us right into part 3, the shipwreck, the tangible wreckage of a godless worldview.
Let's consider the sheer weight of this philosophy for a second. Must we ourselves not become gods simply to appear worthy of it? This question, posed by Nietzsche himself, reveals the incredibly heavy burden of what happens after the death of God. The analysis argues that without some kind of divine lawgiver, we are left entirely to our own subjective human definitions of morality. And in a world where humans are their own gods, well, right and wrong just end up being determined by whoever holds the most power at the time.
And looking straight at the text of the Antichrist, we can see exactly where this logic goes. It's pretty chilling stuff. The source points out that a strictly naturalistic worldview can provide a direct, philosophical justification for eliminating the vulnerable. Think about it. If strength is the only true good, then exterminating the weak gets reframed as an act of charity, just something you do for the progression of the species.
But history actually shows us who ended up picking up this philosophical hammer. After Nietzsche's mental breakdown, his sister, Elizabeth, took over his entire estate, and she actually selectively edited his works to directly align his concepts of the Übermensch and the will to power with the rising Nazi ideology in Germany. Now, scholars fiercely debate what Nietzsche himself would have actually thought of this, but our analysis emphasizes that his philosophical framework made this kind of historical manipulation entirely possible.
So, as the source maps out, the death of God essentially leaves this massive, dangerous void. And what rushes in? Nihilism. Whether we're talking about metaphysical nihilism, which is the belief that nothing is really knowable, or the existential dread that life has absolutely no intrinsic meaning, or the moral void where objective values just don't exist, this is the psychological shipwreck that ultimately follows when that anchor of absolute truth is severed.
All right, so why does all of this matter to us right now? Well, the source material presents a really stark equation here. When you combine evolutionary materialism, the whole survival of the fittest concept, with Nietzsche's purely subjective will to power, it completely removes the inherent sacred value of humanity. It literally provides the intellectual scaffolding needed to justify immense historical atrocities, all perfectly packaged under the banner of the greater good.
To avoid this kind of wreckage, the source outlines a pretty clear call to action. Step 1. Recognize that philosophical drift away from foundational values. Just see it happening. Step 2. Resist subjective ideology that tries to just reshape truth to match human desires. And step 3. Restore a true moral anchor. We have to set our sights once more on absolute truths that actually value all human life.
And I'm going to leave you with this final provocative thought to chew on. In a worldview where the concept of a divine protector is completely dead and gone, and where might makes right, what exactly happens to the people who cannot fight back? It's a huge question, it demands our attention, and it's a pretty powerful reminder of exactly why the ideas we anchor ourselves to matter so deeply. Thanks so much for joining us for this explainer. Keep questioning, keep learning, and we'll see you next time.